There are 18 types in Pokemon, each with their own strengths and weaknesses that make them special, from powerful attackers like the Fire type to defensive monsters that you can find in the Steel type. Everything has something to offer, and today we are going to be covering every single type, explaining their weaknesses, their most famous trainers, and talking about their strongest Pokemon. Naturally, we gotta start with the starter types: Grass, Fire, and Water. That said, before we begin, if you're wondering which Pokemon in each type has the strongest stats, and which type could be best Frankensteined into the best Pokemon possible, check out our video on finding the strongest Pokemon fusion of each type. Anyways, let's get into the Grass. The Grass type is probably the most balanced of the starter trio. It's not exactly a powerhouse like Fire, but it's not the tank that Water tends to be either. Grass sits right in the middle, the jack of all trades, the master of none. It's a type that is all about subtlety, patience, and utility instead of brute force and raw defense. Grass types don't usually win by overpowering their opponents, they win by slowly draining, stalling, or being plain annoying. And that's why so many of them specialize in status effects and utility. The Spore moves, Leech Seed, Synthesis. If you're looking to catch a Pokemon or make your opponent struggle, this is a fantastic typing. Notably, the Grass type is also immune to all Powder and Spore moves, and has Leech Seed as well. On top of that, Grass is one of the most common typings in the game, with nearly 150 Pokemon being included. But how do they line up against other types? Well, Grass is super effective against Water, Ground, and Rock types, making it pretty solid against some of the most defensive typings in the game. Unfortunately, they are resisted by a whopping 7 types. Adding on to that downside, Grass only resists Water, Electric, and Grass, but is weak to Fire, Ice, Poison, Flying, and Bug, some of the most offensive types in the game. So in general, Grass has some pretty rough matchups. That said, this actually makes this type fantastic for early and mid-game gym leaders, as they aren't often going to overpower the players. And because of that, we've seen Grass gym leaders 8 times in the 9 generations, only being absent in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. A big theme for the Grass type is to show off life and growth. And as a result of this, only 4 non-legendary Grass Pokemon don't evolve, those being Maractus, Delmise, Brute Bonnet, and Iron Leaves. And half that list is Paradox Pokemon, so they barely count here. And I don't want to hear about Rotom Mow, he doesn't count, he's an alt form. Grass, being the type most associated with nature, also has the greatest connection to weather-based abilities and attacks. Chlorophyll, Rain Dish, Flower Gift, Harvest, Leaf Guard, Solar Power, Solar Beam, and Synthesis. And similarly, Grass types are often considered to be guardian Pokemon. Even Ash's Bulbasaur was the guardian of his forest before he was caught. And you can see this kind of theming as we see Grass legendaries and mythicals like Celebi, Shaman, and Tapu Bulu. The Grass type also has 8 abilities which are exclusive to them, one of which is Harvest, which belongs to my favorite Pokemon, Trevenant. Others include Overgrowth, Chlorophyll, Leaf Guard, Flower Veil, Flower Gift, and Grass Pelt, most of which are fairly supportive, but in general they also fit the idea of growth under the right conditions. And of course, Grassy Surge, which sets grassy terrain and boosts Grass-type moves, heals each Pokemon each turn, and halves the power of moves like Earthquake and Bulldoze that shake the ground. Pretty fitting to all this, the Grass type is all about balance. It's not too strong, not too weak, not overly defensive, not frail either, and it can make for a great cornerstone to just about any team. Speaking of building a strong foundation though, consider leaving a like and subscribing to Uproar Media so that you can help us build a stronger and better channel so that we can keep getting out great content for you in the future. The next type we have to look at is the Fire type. The Fire type is easily the most aggressive of the starter trio, tending to be made of fast special attackers, though there are quite a few bulky brawlers like Emboar and slow tanks like Camerupt as well. Most Fire Pokemon have great offensive stats and access to strong moves like Flamethrower, Fire Blast, Flare Blitz, or Overheat, but for more defensive Fire types, we also get a signature status effect, Burn. This cuts the target's physical attack by half and deals damage every turn. However, while they don't have access to the variety of status effects that Grass types do, they are way more consistent in applying them, as 19 different fire attacks have a chance to burn the opponent. And while most of them aren't actually defensive options, they can help make up for the fire type's below average defense without making them stray too far from the all-out attacking style that they are known for. Leaning into this, the fire type is super effective against grass, ice, bug, and steel, and is only resisted by water, rock, dragon, and other fire types. And that makes them pretty solid all things considered. And while they don't tend to have high defensive stats, they actually resist a decent amount of types on their own, being fire, grass, ice, bug, steel, and fairy. And they're only weak to water, ground, and rock. Now, that said, water is a super common type, and like every team has a strong ground move like Earthquake on it, so while they aren't weak to a lot of types, they are weak to a very popular set of Pokemon. Even so, they make for pretty powerful Pokemon in general thanks to their well-rounded type dynamics. Despite that, fire is still pretty rare in general, with less than 100 fire types currently being available. And this can make the fire starter option super appealing, as both water and grass types are extremely available, while fire is usually very limited. And the players aren't the only ones who are excited to use this type, as every generation has had either a gym leader or Elite Four member who uses fire. And like the grass type, fire also makes for great use of sunlight, though on top of being tied to specific abilities, Sun also specifically boosts fire moves by 50%. In fact, fire types are often some of the most important Pokemon in a team, as they are the only ones who can get Drought, with the exception of Groudon. That, in tandem with their solid type matchups, can make fire Pokemon a really great core to build a team around, with a grass Pokemon as support. Speaking of support, fire types have some of the most functional abilities in the game. For example, Flash Fire raises the odds of encountering a wild fire type, and Flame Body and Magma Armor, as well as Steam Engine, can reduce the amount of steps needed to hatch an egg by half. In particular, both Flash Fire and Flame Body are also great defensive tools in battle, as Flash Fire makes the Pokemon immune to fire attacks and boosts their damage after absorbing one, and Flame Body has a chance to burn opponents who make contact with them. That said, while there are a few exceptions, fire types can be kind of one note on the battlefield. Thematically, fire is kind of the opposite of grass's themes of harmony and growth. Fire types are explosive, they hit really hard, and then they burn out. However, occasionally we do also have some spiritual themes as well. For example, Pokemon like Chandelure can burn a person's soul away, while Ho-Oh is a Pokemon all about rebirth and a second chance at life. And since we already talked about my favorite grass type, we might as well keep the list going with my favorite fire type, which for me is Victini. Finishing off the core trio is the water type, with a massive 176 Pokemon in its category, making it the most common in the series, which makes sense as, regardless of the region, water is always an important part of the map. While grass was about balance and fire was about offense, water tends to be the defensive option. Though again, with nearly 180 Pokemon, there are plenty of exceptions. In general though, they are pretty bulky. In fact, the first water starter who wasn't really a tank was Froakie in Gen 6. Very few water types even passed the 100-point speed stat, instead relying on other bulkier stats. Even so, because of their sheer number of these Pokemon, it can be extremely flexible and versatile in general. What makes water such an effective type though is how they interact with others. Water is fairly neutral in most matchups, which allow it to really take advantage of their bulk. Offensively, they're great against fire, ground, and rock types, though they are resisted by water, grass, and dragon. Defensively, they resist fire, water, ice, and steel, and they're only weak to electric and grass, meaning very few Pokemon can actually really take them on effectively, and as a result, water could be considered one of the best typings in the game. So we have a very powerful type with few weaknesses, and enough Pokemon to fill in any role. They have tanks like Milotic and Slowbro, physical sweepers like Gyarados, special attackers like Starmie or Inteleon, and speed-boosting menaces like Sharpedo. Throw in a super common priority move like Aqua Jet, solid spread moves like Surf, powerful attacks like Hydro Pump, and one of the strongest setup moves in the game with Shell Smash. However, where the type does fall short is status effects. For the most part, they can confuse Pokemon sometimes with Water Pulse or Burn with Scald, but outside of that, there isn't really much a water Pokemon can do outside of direct damage. Like how the fire type had Sun Setters, water Pokemon have Rain Setters with Drizzle, which is another powerful team building option. Rain is a bit more versatile than Sun in general, healing Pokemon who have Rain Dish or Dry Skin, carrying status effects through Hydration, doubling speed through Swift Swim, and boosting water moves by 50%. Rain also lowers the effectiveness of Synthesis, Morning Sun, Moonlight, and boosts the accuracy of moves like Thunder and Hurricane. So while there isn't much water types can do to weaken their opponents, there's a lot they can do to benefit their own team. As for their signature abilities, water Pokemon have things like Mega Launcher, Torrent, and Water Veil. They also have Water Absorb and Storm Drain, though a few grass types and ground types also get those. It's exactly for this versatility that water is so common to see for gyms and Elite Four members. In fact, in the 9 generations we've had so far, Water has had 11 entries, as Generation 3 had both Wallace and Juan, who was both a gym leader and a champion. And they also had an evil team leader with Archie. In short, Water is probably the single most versatile type in the game and is extremely dependable as an option, and my favorite has just gotta be Spheal, right? Now, it's not super common, but we do also get to use Pikachu as a starter, so we might as well cover Electric next. And these Pokemon stand apart from the others in a pretty distinct way. Grass was balance, fire was power, water was defense, and electric types are all about speed. In fact, they are the second fastest in the game on average after flying. And they can do a lot with that speed, as they're some of the strongest special attackers as well. However, they are super frail with low HP and defenses. Despite not even having 90 Pokemon in this group, electric types are some of the most iconic in the game, and they have fan-favorite trainers like Lieutenant Surge, Watson, Volkner, Alessa, Iono, and Canary, and also Clement and Sophocles, I guess. While they might be rarely used, that's probably because it's just a generally difficult type to deal with. Electric Pokemon are only weak to ground types. In fact, ground is immune to them. But outside of that, only grass and dragon and other electric Pokemon resist them. And as I said, there's just not a lot of electric types. On top of that, they are super effective against 2 of the most common types in the game, being water and flying, though they only resist themselves, flying and steel, which aren't the most common attack types. Not only that, but the electric type's signature status effect can be one of the strongest in the game. Paralysis gives the target a 25% chance of being unable to act, and lowers their speed by half. And like Burn with fire type attacks, many electric moves can inflict this status as a bonus effect, so while you overwhelm them with your damage and speed, you are also slowing them down and can stop them from defending themselves. And if that wasn't enough, electric types are immune to paralysis, so it can't even be used to keep them in check. This is made even more frustrating as electric types have Volt Switch, a move which deals damage then swaps out to another Pokemon, which can be brutal if you are already outspeeding the opponent and can be used as a fantastic way to pivot between your Pokemon and keep momentum going. But what about their abilities? Motor Drive boosts speed when hit by an electric move, while Volt Absorb will heal you if you are hit by one. Lightning Rod redirects electric attacks, and Transistor boosts the power of electric attacks. More iconically though, they have Static, which can paralyze Pokemon who make contact with them. Notably, both Lightning Rod and Static can also be used to raise the encounter rate of electric Pokemon in the wild as well. Finally, Electric Surge sets an electric terrain, which boosts electric moves' power and prevents Pokemon from falling asleep. If I had to describe this type in one word, it would be momentum. Electric Pokemon are all about going as fast as possible, hitting hard, and overwhelming your opponent before they can react. And this makes them some of the most fun Pokemon to use in my opinion. As for my favorite, it's probably Alolan Raichu, though I also really like Mega Manectric. Our last potential starter type is Normal, as we get to see Eevee in Let's Go. This is, ironically, a bit of a weird type, especially when it comes to stats. Normal Pokemon have really high HP and pretty solid speed, but are lackluster in every other category. So they are bulky with poor defense, and fast with not a lot of damage. Like I said, kinda weird. But this is made up for by the fact that they are extremely neutral in most situations, and are rarely a really bad choice to use. That's because they only have one weakness, the fighting type, and they are immune to ghosts, but ghosts are also immune to them. They also are resisted by rock and steel, but outside of that, it's kinda free. And notably, these 4 types, ghost, rock, steel, and fighting, are fairly uncommon considering, so they aren't things that you really need to worry about too often. You can also, if you're really worried about it, have moves like Foresight or Odor Sleuth, as well as an ability like Scrappy to allow normal types to hit ghosts, though that would be a kind of a waste for an attack at the very least. Like electric types, normal type gym leaders are famously some of the hardest to deal with in their game. However, that's usually only the case when we come across them early in the game, like with Whitney, Norman, and Lenora, as it feels like there's just no real direction you can take to overwhelm them. It isn't just like, I just need to catch one of these 5 types to have an advantage. It's just the fighting type. And so normal type gym leaders are often more like stat checks than anything else. However, once the player has time to actually catch fighting types or develop their team in a more well-rounded sense, normal type gym leaders are much more manageable. There are currently just over 150 normal types in the game, which you might think makes them as varied as water types, but in general, Normal types just kind of blur into one big brown, pink, and white blob. That said, despite the name, these Pokemon are often fairly unique and tend to have some of the best gimmicks to them. Eevee has multiple evolution branches, Blissey has the most health in the game, Ditto can transform into anything, Porygon is a digital little dude, Smeargle has Sketch, Slacking Loafs Around, Arceus has Plates, Regigigas has slow starts, Kecleon changes types, Castform changes forms, Lopunny has a very specific fanbase, and Miltank has a very specific fanbase. In battle though, they're pretty much blank slates, as they can either have surprisingly deep move pools, or just be forced to use simple moves like Bite and Takedown that feel pretty lackluster. That said, some normal types can be some of the most fun and interesting Pokemon to use. Mousehold and Chinchino could be holding a King's Rock, Blood Moon Ursaluna is just a monster, Porygon 2 holding an Eviolite, Zangoose with a crit build, Swellow with a guts build, Staraptor, Mega Lopunny, there are so many fun normal types, and as they don't really offer any major weaknesses, they can often fit onto just about any team. As for my favorite, I am a sucker for Stuffle and Porygon 2. But with the starters out of the way, let's get into the main Route 1 types, being Bug and Flying. The Bug type includes an even 100 Pokemon, and kinda like Grass, they're all about growth, though more specifically it's about transformation. Think of the difference between a seed growing into a tree versus a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. In general, the Bug type has a reputation for being weak. In fact, on average, all of their stats are in the bottom 5 of all types. In exchange for this, most Bug-type Pokemon evolve pretty early and require less experience to level up. Basically, they can be powerful early game by reaching their final stages very quickly, but they fall off soon after. Another similarity between Bugs and Grass Pokemon is their ability to put negative effects on their enemies. For example, Bug Bite will eat the opponent's berry. Leech Life will steal health from them. Sticky Web is a hazard that slows all Pokemon who enter. Rage Powder forces opponents to attack a specific Pokemon. They are a surprisingly supportive type. As a result, Bug Pokemon tend to be supportive and disrupt the opponent at every stage of a fight. However, they also have a few rare examples of powerful attackers like Scizor and Heracross, who can be serious threats as well. And offensive Bug types can make use of things like X-Scissor, Megahorn, and of course, U-Turn to dominate the battlefield. And in very special cases, they even have Quiver Dance, which is just an insane stat boosting move. Speaking of which, the Bug type is super effective against Grass, Psychic, and Dark, but where they really suffer is that they are resisted by Fire, Fighting, Poison, Flying, Ghost, Steel, and Fairy, nearly half the types in the game. Alternatively, they do resist Grass, Fighting, and Ground, and they are weak to Fire, Flying, and Rock. As such, they can have a pretty rough time in a lot of battles and need to be used very strategically. Notably, Bug is paired with Flying for Pokemon's typing pretty often, which makes them extremely vulnerable to Stealth Rocks in general. As for their abilities, Bug Pokemon get really interesting tools, even having their own variant of the usual starter ability with Swarm. Then there is Shield Dust, which is an ability to make other Pokemon lose their secondary effects. Compound Eyes boosts your own accuracy by 30% and makes it so wild Pokemon are carrying held items more often, and that can be super useful. And as for their iconic trainers, Bugs actually get used surprisingly little in games, possibly because their stats tend to be so low. As such, they're often relegated to being early game gym leaders like Bugsy, Viola, and Berg. On one occasion, though, they did make it to the Elite Four as Aaron used them in Gen 4. All that said, Bug Pokemon, design-wise, are pretty consistently some of the most excellent in the game. Scizor, Shedinja, Heracross, Volcarona, there are so many cool ones, and we even get cute ones like Snom. Our other Route 1 type is Flying, with over 130 Pokemon in it. This is the fastest type in the game, and in general, they have pretty decent stats, though their defenses aren't usually great. That said, it is a bit of a weird type in that for a very long time there were no pure flying Pokemon, or even Pokemon whose primary type was flying, with the first being Tornadus in Gen 5. Even so, flying types almost always get a spot on most teams for several reasons. Firstly, they're just decent Pokemon that are always given to you early in the game, and they don't fall off as hard as Bugs do. Second, they offer an immunity to the ground type, which is a pretty common and powerful attacking type that is super effective against plenty of Pokemon, making Flying a great pivoting choice. And third, they could use Fly, which was very convenient for a long time. Throw in the ability to use U-turn with their great speed, which basically functions like a second electric type with Volt Switch. Speaking of which, flying is weak to electric, rock, and ice, all very powerful attacking types, which can be a real problem. They're only resisted by electric, rock, and steel, which luckily usually isn't too big of a problem, and on the other hand, they are super effective against and resist grass, fighting, and bug, which is pretty okay. But like I said, the big thing is their ground immunity. Like the water type and the normal type, flyers are pretty decent or neutral in most cases, and that's great. But that all said, as I mentioned, flying Pokemon almost always have a secondary type, so depending on if that type is good or not, it can be really make or break for these Pokemon. Even so, flying Pokemon have some pretty great utility. Strong attacks like Brave Bird, a move that never misses like Aerial Ace. Fly, like I said, a necessity in most games up until recently. They have devastatingly powerful moves with a chance to confuse like Hurricane, and even some solid support options like Tailwind, which will boost your entire team's speed for several turns, or Defog, which can remove hazards. All of this combines to make flying one of the most flexible and effective types in the game. However, you do need to be a bit careful, as they are weak to Stealth Rocks, which, again, is one of the most common hazards in the game. And that damage can really stack up when you're working with a Pokemon that usually relies on pivoting. Ability-wise, flying Pokemon have a few that are really solid. Keen Eye prevents accuracy drops in battle and lowers the odds of encountering weak Pokemon in the wild. Gale Wind gives priority to flying-type moves if the user is at full health, and Big Pecs can stop Pokemon's defenses from being lowered. Though, again, their defenses aren't usually that great to begin with. Not all flying types are great, but the ones that are tend to be infamous for being extremely useful and powerful. Staraptor, Crobat, Salamence, and Togekiss, for example, are monsters. But this type also really lends itself to being legendary. There's something about Pokemon that are literally above others that fits in really well thematically. You have the 5 legendary birds in Gen 1 and 2, Rayquaza, Shaman Sky, the Weather Trio, Yveltal, and Enamorus. The only 2 generations to not have legendary flying types are 7 and 9, and that's kinda cool. As for their iconic trainers, we have Faulkner, Winona, Skyla, Kahili, and Larry's Champion Assessment Team, making them one of the least used types by major trainers, but just like the bug type is kind of regulated to early game because they tend to be weaker, flying type trainers tend to be pretty one-note. They're fast, they hit hard, and that's kinda it. It's similar to the electric type, but they don't offer the same type benefits that the electric type had, as they were only weak to ground in that case. And while this can be super functional, I think it just makes for fights that aren't really exciting or interesting, which might be why Game Freak avoids using them too often. When it comes to my own personal favorite flying types, there's always at least one I like per generation, but I think it's probably between Noivern and Rowlet for me. On to the rock type, which has a reputation for being extremely slow, very tanky, and dealing a ton of physical damage. They are extremely specific Pokemon, and really lean into their theme being the slowest type on average, but having the second highest defense. That said, while their physical stats are great, their special stats are pretty miserable. And sure, there are exceptions to the rule, like Lycanroc, which is pretty quick, and Aurorus, who has decent special attack, but on average. That said, this type has quite a few drawbacks. Firstly, their moves tend to have lower accuracy. Head Smash, Rock Slide, and Stone Edge, for example, are some of the most popular moves for these Pokemon to use, and they all have decent chances to miss. To make up for this, these moves are incredibly strong and have extra effects as well. For example, Rock Slide can hit multiple Pokemon and cause them to flinch, Head Smash has 150 base power, and Stone Edge has a high chance to crit. Outside of that though, Rock-type moves are pretty limited as their pool only has about 25 moves to choose from, and that's including Gigantamax or Z moves, so that can feel pretty rough. But even in that small pool, they have decent support options, things like Salt Cure, Stealth Rock, Wide Guard, and of course, Sandstorm. Sandstorm is yet another great weather condition, which deals damage to all Pokemon every turn, with the exception of Steel, Rock, and Ground types. Rock types in particular really benefit from this, as they get a special defense boost of 50% while in this weather, really rounding out their stats in a decent way. The type matchup for Rock Pokemon is pretty extreme. It's super effective against Fire, Ice, Flying, and Bug, and it resists normal, Fire, Poison, and Flying types, all of which is pretty okay. Rock itself is resisted by Fighting, Ground, and Steel types, but the issue is in their weaknesses. They are weak to water, grass, fighting, ground, and steel. Some of the most common and useful types in the game. Like normal types though, this can all mean that rock trainers are a real problem when you take them on early and don't have options, but once you have a decent pool of Pokemon, they're kind of pushovers, which is why rock trainers like Brock, Roxanne, Rourke, Grant, and Olivia are early game trainers. This is actually a really important type when it comes to teaching the player about type matchups as a result of all that. In general, this is just a very straightforward defensive type with solid attacks, though they do have many shortfalls. As for my favorite rock types, I really like Larvitar, Terrakion, and Tyrantrum. That brings us to the Poison type, a fairly below average type in terms of stats, who makes up for it with their signature status effect, Poison and Toxic. In each case, the affected Pokemon will take a chunk of damage at the end of each round, and in Toxic's case, that amount will increase each time. In terms of type matchups, Poison is a bit weird. It's an extremely defensive typing. This way you can poison the opponents and live long enough to watch them wear away. Poison Pokemon resist grass, fighting, bug, poison, and fairy, and they're only weak to ground and psychic. However, they're only super effective against grass and fairy, and their attacks are resisted by poison, ground, rock, and ghost, which isn't actually too bad, as those types aren't super common. The real problem is that steel types are immune to both poison attacks and the poison status, so they can get totally walled out here. And that might be why we almost never see prevalent trainers, only including Koga, Janine, Roxy, and Atticus so far, though Corbo in ZA also uses poison types. Poison has a bunch of really interesting abilities. Corrosion allows them to poison steel types, Poison Touch and Poison Heal are nearly exclusive to poison types, and will poison the opponent on contact. Liquid Ooze damages Pokemon that try to use draining attacks against them, and Merciless raises your damage against poisoned enemies. Stench is a very functional one that lowers the odds of finding wild Pokemon and gives a 10% chance to make enemies flinch after making contact. And Toxic Debris will drop Toxic Spikes if the user is hit by a physical attack. Speaking of which, Toxic Spikes is the poison type hazard. If one layer is set up, the opponents who switch in will be poisoned, and if two are set up, they will be infected by Toxic. However, if they switch in a poison type, those spikes will be absorbed and removed. Now that all said, nearly every poison type move has a chance to poison the enemy, which can be pretty powerful, especially when paired with Venoshock, an attack that deals double damage if the target is poisoned. One thing that the poison type doesn't do though is buff itself, at least not very often. They have Acid Armor and Coil, which can be used to raise their stats, but outside of that, there's not much they can do in this category. On the flip side, they do have Clear Smog, which also removes your opponent's stat changes as well. So while they don't buff much, they don't let the opponent buff either. For a long time, Poison was considered a weak or niche type, but over time it's become a lot more useful, especially with the introduction of Fairy types in Gen 6. Design-wise, they tend to be based on toxic plants, pollution, venomous animals, and decay. You've got everything from literal sludge piles like Muck, to deadly flowers like Roserade, and modern Pokemon like Revavroom, who give off exhaust. When it comes to poison types, I am a huge fan of Roserade, Crobat, and Iron Moth. Next up, we have one of the most powerful types in the game, Psychic. That said, they used to be even stronger than they are now. Back in Generation 1, it was completely broken. Almost nothing resisted it, and it only had one weakness, Bug, which had a whole 4 attacks in the game. String Shot, which doesn't even do damage, Pin Missile, which is pretty inconsistent at best, Leech Life, which used to have a base power of 20, and Twin Needle, which could only be learned by Beedrill and was pretty weak. Psychic types basically ruled the game until Game Freak rebalanced things in later generations. But even now, they remain to be one of the most iconic and flexible types in the series. Psychic Pokemon usually focus on high special attack and special defense with decent speed, though they do have low physical attack. But that's not actually a detriment to them, as while they typically have moves like Psychic that deals special damage, they also have moves like Psyshock, which is a special move that affects defense rather than special defense. Even so, with over 130 Psychic types out there, you can find one for any role. Special sweepers like Alakazam, defensive walls like Uxie, and even a few physical attackers like Gallade. On top of that, Psychic has some fantastic support moves. Trick Room to make slow Pokemon move first, Calm Mind to boost their special stats, Recover to recover. Several moves can cause confusion, lower stats, flinch, and even do things like swap items or abilities with other Pokemon. On top of that, we've talked about how powerful neutral typing can be, and psychic types interact with very few others. They are super effective against fighting and poison types, which admittedly isn't fantastic, but they are only resisted by other psychic types and steel types. And admittedly, they are completely useless against dark types who are immune to them. On the other hand, they're only resisted by fighting and psychic, and they're weak to bug, ghost, and dark, which many people say is because psychic types are meant to represent humanity in some way, and people tend to be afraid of the dark, of bugs, and of ghosts. Psychic types have the Synchronize ability, which copies any status effect applied to the Pokemon to the opponent as well. However, it also forces wild Pokemon to have the same nature as the user, making it super effective for building a team. Magic Bounce outside of Megas is also exclusive to the Psychic type and reflects any non-damaging move back to the opponent. This can be extremely powerful if you catch the enemy off guard with it. And of course, Psychic Surge sets a Psychic Terrain, which boosts all Psychic type moves and prevents priority moves. And this can be super helpful if you are using a frail and fast Pokemon like Alakazam. As a result of all this, Psychic tends to be a type that we come across in later parts of the game. Sabrina, Tate and Liza, and Olympia, for example, are the last few badges in their respective region, and Will, Lucian, and Caitlyn are even Elite Four members. This is just all in all one of the strongest types in the game, and they can fill so many different roles. And that's probably why I like so many of them. Slowbro, Espeon, Victini, Jirachi, and Alolan Raichu are just all-around awesome Pokemon that I absolutely love both in terms of design and using them in-game. The polar opposite of the Psychic type is Fighting, Pokemon that are all about physical attack, with an average attack stat for this type being nearly 110. Their speed, defense, and HP are really solid as well, but their special attack is abysmal. This type is all about attacking first and thinking later, which can be best shown off in their iconic move, High Jump Kick, which has a chance to miss and to heavily injure your own Pokemon if it does. Close combat also does a ton of damage but lowers your defenses after being used. On the other hand, if you want to take things slower, fighting types can take time to set up as well with moves like Bulk Up and Focus Energy. But to show off just how much fighting types lean into that physical side, you can see that there are only 5 special psychic moves, being Vacuum Wave, Secret Sword, Focus Blast, Final Gambit, and Aura Sphere. The fighting type also differs from Psychic in that they interact with just about every type in the game, being super effective against Normal, Ice, Rock, Dark, and Steel, and it is resisted by Poison, Flying, Bug, Psychic, and Fairy. On top of that, it can't hurt Ghost at all. That is 11 of the 18 types. In fact, the only types that they don't interact with are the starters, Electric, Ground, Fighting, and Dragon. On the defensive, Fighting resists Bug, Rock, and Dark, and is weak to Flying, Psychic, and Fairy. Because of this, Fighting-type trainers can appear at any point in the game. Early gyms like Brawly, mid-game gyms like Maylene, Corina, and Bay, or even in the Elite Four like Marshall. Because they are so flexible in their type dynamics, they can be slotted just about anywhere, which makes them extremely useful for game design. That said, in terms of Pokemon design, I'm usually not a big fan of a lot of fighting types because a lot of them are just like dudes, but I am a huge fan of Heracross, Beware, and Phalanx. A type I do like a lot though is Ghost. This was originally the most exclusive type in the series, as only the Gengar line was in it. Even Generation 2 only added Mischievous, though since Gen 3 we have been getting a much more steady influx of Ghost Pokemon, though even still there are less than 90 in total to this day. As the type suggests, many of these Pokemon are spirits, which according to the Pokedex have come from people, animal, or even inanimate objects, as they're basically Japanese yokai, which is a really cool theme I think. And fitting to that theme of not having corporeal bodies and not being able to move on, most of them have very low physical attack and speed. However, their defenses and special attacks are pretty solid, because how are you going to hit something that's already dead? And of course, that connection to spirituality leans into the special attacking theme. Ghost Pokemon are super effective against Psychic and other ghosts, and they're only resisted by Dark, though Normal is immune to them. At the same time, Ghost is immune to Fighting and Normal, resists Bug and Poison, and is only weak to Ghost and Dark. This is such a good typing, as it barely interacts with anything and offers 2 immunities, more so than any other type in the game. As for their attacks, ghosts have so many iconic ones. Shadow Ball is their premier attacking move, which also has a chance to lower special defense. Confuse Ray, Nightshade, and Astonish are all really solid utility options, especially early game. Curse works special for ghost types, cutting their own HP in half, and then dealing huge damage every turn to the target. Destiny Bond kills the opponent if the user dies from an attack in that turn, and Hex deals double damage if the target has a status effect. They don't have a huge catalog of moves or a ton of Pokemon in their pool, but they feel super diverse and unique thanks to these strange ghost Pokemon available. Shedinja, Goldengo, Annihilape, Dragapult, Trevenant, Giratina, Rotom, Sableye, Aegislash, Houndstone. Like, all of these Pokemon work in completely unique ways, and the ghost type really feels like a group that Game Freak uses to experiment with particularly interesting ideas as a result of that. That said, this type is inherently difficult for the player to deal with, especially early on, when most Pokemon only know normal type moves and maybe one elemental move. As such, they can't be put too early in the game, so we don't usually see trainers like Morty or Fantina until the middle of the run. However, many of them, like Chantal, Phoebe, and Agatha, end up in the Elite Four. Ghost is just a super flexible and dynamic type that is always really fun to use, and that's why it's so hard to pick a favorite from it. Shedinja, Chandelure, Frostlass, and Marshadow are big standouts, but Phantump is my favorite Pokemon of all time, so they do win by default. Next, we have one of the most offensive and least defensive types in the game, the Ice type. Ice is strong against some of the most common and powerful types, including Grass, Ground, Flying, and Dragon, which is great, right? Well, then we get to the negatives. Ice only resists other ice Pokemon, which is the rarest type in the game. It is then resisted by Water, Fire, Ice, and Steel, and they are weak to Fire, Rock, Fighting, and Steel. On average, Ice is pretty strong against many of the sweeper Pokemon out there, but they struggle against bulkier ones, and they don't really protect themselves from anything. That said, almost all of their stats are above average, with them leaning towards physical stats a little bit and having the second highest HP in the game. Fitting to all of this, Ice-type trainers tend to appear later in the game as they can easily sweep you if they get the advantage. Price, Candice, Melanie, Wulfric, Bryson, and Grusha are all mid to late game gym leaders, and both Lorelei and Glacia appear in the Elite Four. Ice is also our next weather condition type, which used to be Hail but is now Snow. Hail worked similar to Sandstorm as it dealt chip damage every turn to everything but Ice types, while also boosting Blizzard's accuracy. In Gen 4, Hail even let Blizzard break through Protect sometimes. But now, Snow simply boosts the defense of Ice types. That said, it does interact with several Ice type abilities. Ice Body will heal you in the snow, Snow Cloak boosts your evasion and lowers the odds of finding wild Pokemon, Slush Rush boosts your speed, and Snow Warning can create the snow weather condition. However, this is probably the worst of the weather conditions and offers the least synergies, which is unfortunate because the other three are just so strong. Even so, Ice types are powerful options for most teams if you need a sweeper. Things like Weavile, Chien-Pao, or even Iron Bundle. And they can be pretty bulky with Pokemon like Avalugg or Mamoswine, though making them your main defensive option might mean that you need to work a bit harder for the rest of your team. Either option has some pretty amazing attacks though: Avalanche, Blizzard, Ice Beam, Icicle Crash, Icy Wind, Triple Axle, and Ice Shard, along with tons of other options. But one of the coolest options that they have is Freeze Dry, which is an Ice-type move that is super effective against Water types, and I just think that's really rad. Like I said though, there are barely any Ice types in the game, but there are still some that stand out to me. Specifically, Frostlass, Chien-Pao, Cloyster, and of course, the boy himself, Spheal. That actually brings us to another very powerful physical type that is just about useless when it comes to special stats and speed. The Ground type. Ground is one of the most reliable and well-rounded offensive types in the series, being super effective against Fire, Poison, Rock, Steel, and being the only type that is super effective against Electric, which as we mentioned is a pretty powerful type, so that is important. The only other types that resist it are Grass and Bug, and while Flying does have a Ground immunity, Ground also has an Electric immunity, so it kinda balances out. Other than that, Ground resists both Poison and Rock, but the real problem comes with its weaknesses. Water, Grass, and Ice, two of the most common types of the game, and Ice, who we've already established is one of the best attacking types in the game. so that can be a pretty considerable problem. Ground probably also has the single most iconic attack in the game, being Earthquake, a super powerful attack that hits multiple enemies and is almost a staple on just about every team. Otherwise, we have things like Bulldoze, Dig, Drill Run, Earth Power, Fissure, Magnitude, Stomping Tantrum, and even a hazard move in Spikes. It doesn't get much attention for being flashy, but it does put in a ton of work in battles. Ground Pokemon are strong, bulky, and practical. They hit hard, take hits well, and have some of the best coverage in the game. And a lot of their attacks have solid secondary effects that lower speed, accuracy, or defenses, which can make their moves even more useful as well. Ground is also the second type along with Rock that makes use of Sandstorm, with abilities like Sand Rush and Sand Force to benefit from the Sandstorm even more. Though again, these abilities are shared between those two types. Interestingly though, despite the Ground type being slanted to the physical stats and having common weaknesses, because of all their good factors, they are still pretty powerful, to the point where their gyms tend to be some of the hardest in their games. Giovanni, Clay, and Rika, for example. It's just an all-around consistent and strong type that is going to deal some solid damage and tank a few hits without much of a problem, as long as they aren't in front of a flying type. That said, I'm not a huge fan of most ground types in terms of design, but a few really stand out, being Garchomp, Excadrill, Runegrigus, Ursaluna, and the best of them all, Vampy. The last of the types available in the original games is Dragon. Pound for pound the strongest type, with all of their stats ranking in the top 3 for their category on average. And if pure stats isn't enough, their type matchups are crazy. Sure, they are only strong against dragons, but they are also only resisted by Steel. They themselves then resist all 4 of the main starter types: Fire, Water, Grass, and Electric. And they're only weak to Ice and Dragon, the rarest of all types in the game. This made them so powerful that in Gen 6, Game Freak had to add the Fairy type to the game to balance them out, and they felt that the Dragon dominance was so extreme that they made Fairies immune to Dragon type attacks. Even so, it remains to be insanely strong, and they have powerful moves like Dragon Claw, Draco Meteor, and Dragon Tail, and most importantly, Dragon Dance, one of the best setup moves ever. That said, the actual list of dragon moves is pretty short, and many of the moves that are on there are exclusive to Pokemon like Dialga with Roar of Time, for example. Speaking of which, dragons obviously naturally slot into legendary and pseudo-legendary roles very easily, and as a result, plenty of them just have a ton of stats. And quick side note, if you're interested in learning about either of those categories, we have a video on both every pseudo-legendary and every legendary that I think you'd really like. This type, though, is often used as a kind of boss battle encounter. Trainers like Lance, Drake, Claire, Iris, Drayden, Drasna, Raihan, and Hassel are either all Elite Four members, or the last gym that you need to clear in order to reach the Elite Four. Like Flying, Dragon is almost always paired with another type as well, and that can be pretty make or break to determine how good they really are, though. Ground and Dragon makes for some brutal attackers, though they're very vulnerable to ice, and the same thing is true for Dragon Flying Pokemon. On the other hand, when combined with Water, you have what is probably a top 3 type in the game, just behind Dark and Ghost and Steel and Fairy. That said, the one place that Dragon Pokemon tend to be weak on is their abilities. Many of them have very simple things like Pressure, or pretty useless things like Garchomp with Sand Veil. Even decent abilities like Levitate on Hydreigon or Flagon aren't really helping the Pokemon, as they aren't weak to ground to begin with, though the immunity is kinda nice. However, when a dragon gets a good ability, it can be a monster. Intimidate and Moxie on Salamence, Multiscale on Dragonite. Some dragons even get their own unique abilities like Reshiram and Zekrom, or Goodra, Hydrapple, Miraidon, and Koraidon. The really cool part about dragons, though, is that like the ghost type, they just have such varied designs. Like, sure, you do get a bunch of just standard dragons, but like, look at the variety between Hydrapple, Walking Wake, Guzzlord, Zygarde Complete, Goomy, Rayquaza, and Altaria. But of course, the best of all dragons are going to be Kingdra, Dragapult, and Goomy, in my opinion. Generation 2 added 2 new types to counter the Psychic type's dominance, first of which was Steel, and this is the ultimate defensive type, resisting 10 other types, being immune to poison, and only being weak to fire, fighting, and ground. Taking these things on can be rough. On the other side though, they are only strong against ice, rock, and fairy, and they are resisted by fire, water, electric, and steel, which is unfortunately a pretty big group. Aside from having the best defense among any type and top tier attack and special defense though, steel is super slow and has fairly low health and terrible special attack. In many ways, it's kind of like an upgraded rock type. That said, the move pool that they have is surprisingly solid. Stat boosts like Atomize, Gear Up, and Shift Gear can be super strong. Attacks like Steel Beam, Iron Head, and Bullet Punch can deal serious damage, and of course, moves that turn their weaknesses into an asset. Gyro Ball for their low speed, and Heavy Slam for their weight. Notably, abilities like Heavy Metal or Light Metal can also adjust that Pokemon's weight if needed, and make these moves even more or less effective. That said, the gap between a good and bad steel type is pretty brutal. In a lot of cases like Bastiodon, they kind of have high defenses and nothing else going on. But in other cases, they are able to add that defense to a great move pool like we see with Aggron, Fortress, and Ferrothorn to become these insurmountable walls. Where these Pokemon get really scary though is steel type attackers. Lucario, Bisharp, Metagross, and Scizor, for example, take the massive amount of resistances that the type has and then try to sweep through enemy teams with them. Sweepers are already hard to deal with once they get momentum, but if they resist most other types in the game, it is even harder. And the best steel type trainers like Steven really make use of that. And of course, like Poison, Steel also received a buff with the introduction and the prominence of fairy types, as they are the main countermeasures to deal with them. As for my favorite steel type, it has gotta be Scizor for me. I just love everything about this thing. The design is great, he's extremely fun to use, has several different effective builds, and his Mega looks like he is straight out of a Mega Man game. I think he is so cool. Like, look at those little hand claws, that's awesome. The other Gen 2 type is Dark, my personal favorite type in the game. Where Steel handled Psychic defensively, Dark was meant to handle it offensively, and it's a type that's all about deception, trickery, and punishment rather than pure stats. And this is depicted through the fact that all of Dark's moves have secondary effects that take advantage of the opponent. Bite and Dark Pulse both cause flinching, Ceaseless Edge sets up spikes, Crunch lowers defense, Feint Attack and False Surrender ignore evasion and accuracy. Foul Play literally uses your opponent's attack stat against them. It is just such a cool idea for a Pokemon type. Where Fire types burn and Electric types paralyze, Dark types take the opponent apart piece by piece and turn your opponent's strengths against them. And if that wasn't enough, Dark types are fairly fast, have a lot of health, and have solid offensive stats, though again, their defenses are kinda low. And their type matchups are actually pretty interesting, only being strong against Psychic and Ghost, which are fairly rare, and being resisted by Fighting, Dark, and Fairy. On the defensive side, they are immune to Psychic, and resist both Ghost and Dark while being weak to Fighting, Bug, and Fairy. While the Bug weakness isn't too bad, being weak to Fighting when you have low defense, and being weak to the many Fairy types out there, is pretty rough. For a long time, the Dark type was the only type to not be represented by a gym leader and only appeared in the Elite Four through Karen, Sydney, and Grimsley. Nanu was the first gym leader, or at least a kahuna, and Pierce was the first proper Dark type gym leader, all the way in Generation 8. Overall, the Dark type is about control through disruption, making the most out of status effects, stat changes, and brute force to overwhelm their opponents. They are so fun, and that is why they're my favorite. But if I had to choose a favorite, it's probably Zoroark. In my opinion, this is the Dark type. It is fast, it hits hard, it has the Illusion ability, which allows it to disguise itself as another one of your Pokemon when it enters to play mind games on the enemy, and it's just always so funny when it works. And our final type is Fairy, which was added in Generation 6 to put a stop to the dominance of the Dragon type. Fairies are a fairly bulky group on the special side, kind of the defensive flip of the Psychic type, who offers many of the same strengths and weaknesses that that type had. Aside from being immune to dragons, fairies also resist Fighting, Bug, and Dark, and they are resisted by Fire, Poison, and Steel. Fairies are weak to both Steel and Poison, which suddenly became extremely popular and powerful when they arrived. Meanwhile, fairies are super effective against dragons, Dark, and Fighting. This is such a solid type that is really hard to deal with. Poison and steel moves aren't exactly the most common, and now you suddenly have to funnel them onto your team. You literally have to build with them in mind because they're so prominent, and depending on what type they're paired with, they can become menaces. Steel Fairy, for example, is the best type combination in the game, and it's just crazy hard to deal with. Despite their mainly defensive uses through Pokemon like Clefable and Florges, Fairy has some really powerful attacks in it as well, like Moonblast, Dazzling Gleam, and Play Rough, but they also have supporting moves like Charm, Floral Healing, and Moonlight as well. Interestingly enough, their exclusive ability, Flower Veil, only works if partnered with a grass Pokemon and will protect that Pokemon from having their stats lowered. They also have Misty Surge, which sets up a misty terrain and reduces Dragon-type attack damage by half while protecting from several different status conditions. Design-wise, fairy Pokemon are based on mythical creatures, natural spirits, and elegant forms of life. But they're not all soft and harmless. Some are gentle like Sylveon and Florges, but others like Mawile, Grimmsnarl, and Zacian show that the type can also be intimidating and aggressive when they want to be. Since its introduction, we've seen fairy-type trainers presented in every generation. Valerie in Gen 6, Mina in Gen 7, Opal and Bede in Gen 8, and Ortega in Gen 9. These Pokemon are just generally well balanced, combining support and decent power, though as I said, they do lack on the physical side usually. There are plenty of fairy Pokemon I really enjoy, but Alolan Ninetales is easily my favorite. However, I do think that Mega Gardevoir has the single best shiny in the series. But with that, we have covered all 18 Pokemon types, from the utility of grass types to the overwhelming power of dragons and the surprisingly defensive fairies. Whether you prefer bulky tanks, fast sweepers, or status-heavy disruptors, there's a type that fits you and how you like to play, and understanding how they interact with each other is the foundation for building a good team. Each type fits a specific role and offers something special, but which is your favorite? For me, it is between Dark and Ghost. They just play in such fun and unique ways that I never get bored of using them. If you made it through this video, congratulations, you are officially more knowledgeable about Pokemon types than half of the in-game trainers, and several of the real ones too. With all that being said though, if you enjoyed, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more in the future. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.